Just once. Please. Diego Garcia's voice, a man who'd never begged anyone for anything, broke on the last word as he knelt on the cold tile of a nearly empty flower shop, his son screaming in his arms. Joyce Thompson stood frozen behind the counter, potting soil under her nails and a grief she'd told no one about pressing on her chest. For 3 weeks now, her body had kept doing what it used to do for a baby who never came home. The shop's bell hadn't rung in days. The bank had already sent its second notice. Orlando had stopped noticing her existed. But when Theo's cry cut through the quiet, something in Joyce moved before her mind caught up. She crossed the room, reached out, and said, "Give him to me." Tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from today. Subscribe if you want to see how far this goes. What Joyce finds inside that mansion will change everything she thought she knew about the man kneeling in front of her. The bell above the shop door hadn't rung since Tuesday, and Joyce Thompson had stopped expecting it to. She stood among buckets of roses that were beginning to wilt faster than she could sell them, running her thumb along the edge of a past due notice she'd already read 4 times. The numbers didn't change no matter how long she stared. Rent, wholesale invoices, the loan she'd taken out the year everything fell apart. All of it stacked higher than the shop had ever earned in a month. Outside, Orlando's rare cold snap fogged the windows, and Joyce hugged her cardigan tighter, telling herself it was the weather making her shiver and not the quiet panic sitting behind her ribs. She didn't let herself think about the nursery she'd painted and never used. Not today. Today was for surviving until tomorrow. Across the city, in a house with iron gates and armed men who didn't ask questions, Diego Garcia stood over a crib that had been empty of peace for 11 days straight. His son Theo was screaming again, small fists shaking, face red from a hunger that refused every bottle the nurses tried. Diego had buried men who crossed him without blinking. He had built an empire on fear and precision. None of it meant anything in this room. A specialist had come and gone that morning, offering formulas, supplements, theories. And still Theo cried, thinner each day, weaker each night, mourning a mother he'd never had the chance to know. Diego pressed a hand against the crib rail, tattooed knuckles white with the grip. He was a man used to solving problems with money or violence, and this was the first one that answered to neither. Somewhere in the house, one of his men murmured that the doctors were running out of options. Diego didn't respond. He was already thinking of something else, a rumor one of his men had mentioned in passing, about a florist across town whose milk hadn't stopped coming since she lost her own child. He grabbed his coat. The bell rang. Joyce looked up, expecting no one, and found 2 men in black suits filling her doorway first, sunglasses on despite the gray afternoon, hands folded in front of them like sentries. She had a half-second to feel afraid before the third man stepped through. Tall, tattooed to the collar, cradling something wrapped in white against his chest that was shaking the air apart with its cries. "Please." His voice didn't match the rest of him. It cracked open on the single word. "I'll pay anything you want. Just please." Joyce's hands had gone still on the counter. She recognized him, or recognized the shape of who he was, the kind of man Orlando whispered about and never said out loud. None of that mattered in the moment his knees hit her floor, right there among the buckets of tulips, a man who commanded armed guards suddenly small and undone in front of her. "His name is Theo," Diego said, and something in his composure gave way entirely. "He won't eat. He hasn't eaten right in days. His mother," he stopped, "couldn't finish it. Didn't have to." The baby's cry hit something in Joyce that she hadn't let herself feel in 3 weeks, a physical ache that answered before her mind caught up to what was happening. She was already moving around the counter, already reaching, and Diego lifted the baby toward her like he was handing over the only thing left that mattered. The second Theo settled against her, his cries broke into hiccups, then into silence. Joyce looked down at the small red face finally going slack with relief, and felt her own eyes sting. Behind her, she was aware of the guards, the cold air still clinging to Diego's coat, the absurdity of a man like this on his knees in her shop. None of it felt as real as the weight in her arms. "There," she whispered, mostly to the baby. "There you go." Diego didn't get up. He just watched her, like he couldn't quite believe it either. The gates alone took Joyce's breath away. Iron 12 feet high, cameras mounted at intervals like unblinking eyes. A guard waved the car through without a word, and the mansion rose up beyond a curve of manicured hedges, all stone and glass and silence. It didn't look like a home. It looked like something built to keep the world out. Diego carried her single suitcase himself, Theo asleep against Joyce's shoulder, and led her through halls that echoed with her footsteps. Everything was expensive and cold. Marble floors, dark furniture, art that looked chosen for its price tag rather than anything it made a person feel. Joyce had grown up in a house with peeling paint and a mother who filled every room with something blooming. This place had nothing alive in it at all. "Your room is down that hall," Diego said, gesturing vaguely, already distracted by his phone buzzing in his pocket. "Theo's is beside it. Anything you need, tell Marisol." He said it like a man reciting instructions he'd memorized rather than considered. Joyce nodded, adjusting the baby in her arms, and didn't say what she was thinking, that a house this size shouldn't feel this empty. By her second morning, she'd already rearranged things without asking. A vase of grocery store daisies on the kitchen island. Sunlight let into the nursery through curtains she'd pulled fully open for the first time in what looked like months. She sang to Theo while she fed him, low and off-key, and didn't notice at first that one of the guards had paused in the doorway to listen. Slowly, carefully, the house began to change shape around her. Staff who used to move through the halls in silence started greeting her by name. Diego, when he was home, lingered near the nursery door longer than he needed to, watching Joyce hum to his son like it was the most natural thing in the world. For the first time since Theo was born, the house felt less like a fortress and more like it might, someday, be a home. It was the formula that first caught her attention. Not the brand, which she'd grown used to, but the seal. Joyce had opened dozens of these canisters by now, and she knew the small foil ring that peeled away clean every time. This one gave with a faint resistance, like it had already been broken and pressed shut again. She told herself it was nothing. New shipment, different batch, maybe a factory inconsistency. But that night, mixing a bottle under the kitchen light, she noticed the powder was a shade paler than usual, and dissolved strangely, leaving a thin film along the glass that hadn't been there before. Joyce didn't feed it to him. She sat up long after the house had gone quiet, turning the canister over in her hands, running through every rational explanation she could think of and believing none of them. In the morning, she said nothing to Diego. Instead, she asked Marisol, carefully, who handled deliveries to the estate. Marisol's answer came a beat too slow, her eyes flicking toward the hallway before she spoke. That unease sent Joyce wandering the house that afternoon with Theo on her hip, more watchful than she let on. She passed the security office once, twice, and on the third pass found the door left ajar, monitors glowing over a bank of empty chairs. She wasn't looking for anything, but her eyes caught the timestamp on one screen, and then on another beside it, and the numbers didn't match. 12 minutes missing from the East Gate feed. 8 from the delivery entrance. Gaps too clean to be accidents. Joyce backed away before anyone saw her standing there, heart hammering, Theo's small weight suddenly feeling like the only steady thing in a room. She thought of the canister upstairs, hidden now at the back of a cabinet. She thought of Diego's face the day he'd knelt in her shop, desperate and unguarded, and wondered whether the danger to his son had ever really stopped, or whether it had simply moved closer, quiet enough to walk these halls unnoticed. That night, she locked the nursery door for the first time. Dr. Alvarez had been with the Garcia household longer than almost anyone, a quiet man with steady hands who delivered half the children born into this world of iron gates and armed silence. Joyce trusted him the way she trusted very few people in this house, and when she finally laid the tampered canister on his desk, she watched his easy expression fall away entirely. "This isn't spoilage," he said, turning it under the light, running a gloved finger along the broken seal. "Someone's been altering the composition." He tested a sample that evening in the small lab off his office, and by morning he had a name for what he'd found: a diluted contaminant, subtle enough to pass as a manufacturing flaw, dangerous enough to do real damage over time. Someone wanted this to look like an accident, he told her. Someone patient. Joyce thought of the security gaps she'd seen, the timestamps that didn't line up, and asked him quietly who had access to both the deliveries and the cameras. Alvarez didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice had dropped low enough that she had to lean in. "Mateo," he said. "He signs off on both." The name settled into her like something cold. Mateo Vance, Diego's second, always a step behind him at meetings, always smiling in a way that never reached his eyes. Joyce had noticed how the staff went quiet whenever he entered a room, how even Diego's guards seemed to straighten under his gaze like they weren't sure whose orders they were following. Over the next 2 days, she and Alvarez worked in careful secrecy, cross-referencing delivery logs against the missing footage, building a timeline neither of them said aloud what it meant. Every thread led back to the same place. Every gap in the cameras matched a moment Mateo had been near the nursery wing. By the time Joyce sealed the evidence into a folder, her hands were steady but her mind was racing far ahead. To Diego, to what this would do to him, to how close danger had actually come to the baby sleeping down the hall. She just had to find a way to tell him before Mateo realized she knew. Joyce told herself the trip back to her shop was routine. Checking on the register, the unsold stock, the life she'd left half-finished when Diego knelt on her floor weeks ago. She hadn't told him about the folder yet. She wanted to see his face when she did, wanted to be sure of every detail before she put a target on Alvarez's back along with her own. One more errand, she told herself. Then she'd go straight to Diego. The shop felt smaller than she remembered. Dust already gathering on the counter, the flowers she'd left behind long since wilted and thrown out by whoever had been paying the bills in her absence. She was reaching for the folder in her bag, checking it was still there, when the bell above the door rang. She expected a customer. She got 2 men she didn't recognize, moving with the same practiced quiet as Diego's guards, except their eyes held none of the familiarity she'd grown used to. Ms. Thompson. The taller one said her name like he already owned it. Mateo would like a word. Joyce's stomach dropped straight through the floor. She reached for her phone and didn't get close before a hand closed over her wrist, firm and clinical, no anger in it at all, which frightened her more than rage would have. She thought of Theo, of the bottle he'd need in an hour, of Diego somewhere across the city with no idea what was happening. She fought. It didn't matter. A cloth pressed over her mouth, sharp and chemical, and the last thing she registered was the folder slipping from her bag, papers scattering across the floor of the shop she'd nearly lost twice now, once to debt and now to a man who wanted her silenced before she could speak. When her eyes opened again, the shop was gone. Concrete walls. A single bulb overhead. And somewhere beyond the door, low voices discussing what to do with her, like she was already a loose end instead of a person. Diego found the scattered papers before he found anything else. Joyce's folder, pages fanned across the floor of her shop like something had torn through in a hurry. He didn't need to read all of it to understand. Mateo's name was circled twice in Alvarez's handwriting, and that was enough. The call came an hour later, Mateo's voice smooth and unbothered on the other end, like they were discussing shipping routes instead of a woman's life. "She's safe," he said. "For now. You sign the territory over to me, all of it, and she walks. You come for her instead, and I promise you won't like what's left to find." Diego didn't raise his voice. He'd learned long ago that the quietest threats carried the furthest. "You'll regret this," he said, and hung up before Mateo could answer. He gathered his men in the war room within the hour, every face grim and ready, weapons laid out across the table like the only language left that mattered. Diego moved among them with a calm that unsettled even the ones who'd known him for years. Not the calm of control, but of a man who had already decided there was nothing left to lose. "He's at the harbor warehouse," Diego said, pointing to the map. "We go in fast, we go in hard, and no one touches her." His eyes swept the room. No one. By nightfall, convoys of black cars moved through Orlando's empty streets toward the docks. Headlights off, engines idling low as they closed in on the warehouse where dim light spilled from cracked windows onto black water. Diego rode in the lead car, jaw tight, hands steady despite everything roaring underneath. He thought of Joyce's voice, low and warm, singing to Theo in a nursery that used to be silent. He thought of her stepping forward in her shop weeks ago, unafraid of a man everyone else feared. Whatever Mateo believed he was about to take from him, Diego intended to make sure it cost him everything. The warehouse doors came into view. Diego gave the signal. The first gunshot cracked through the warehouse like the world splitting open, and Joyce, bound to a chair in the back office, jerked hard enough to nearly tip herself over. Chaos exploded on the other side of the door. Shouting, more gunfire, footsteps pounding in every direction. She had no way of knowing Diego had brought Theo, refusing to leave him behind with the mansion compromised, keeping him close under guard in the car until everything went wrong at once and a stray unit broke through the perimeter near where the baby waited. She heard it before she understood it. Theo's cry, thin and terrified, somewhere frighteningly close. Adrenaline did what the ropes couldn't. Joyce twisted her wrists raw, felt something give, and threw herself out of the chair the second her hands came free. She burst through the door into smoke and noise, into a scene that didn't make sense until it did. One of Diego's men shielding Theo's carrier with his own body, pinned down, another gunman rounding the corner with a clear line no one else could reach in time. Joyce didn't think. She ran. She hit the carrier and rolled, curling herself over Theo's small body the instant before the shot rang out, a white-hot line of pain tearing across her shoulder as she absorbed what should have found the baby beneath her. She didn't let go. Even as her vision swam, even as the pain roared louder than the gunfire around her, she kept her body curved protectively over Theo, who was screaming but whole, untouched, alive. Diego reached her seconds later, dropping to his knees for the second time since they'd met. Hands shaking as he checked her wound, checked his son, checked her again like he couldn't believe both of them had survived. "I'm okay," Joyce managed, breathless, blood soaking through her sleeve. "He's okay." Diego's face broke in a way she'd never seen. Raw, undone, something between fury at what had almost happened and a fierce, overwhelming gratitude. "You saved him," he said quietly. "You saved both of us." A year had softened almost everything about the Garcia estate. The iron gates still stood, but they opened now onto a driveway lined with the flower beds Joyce had insisted on planting herself, color spilling across what used to be bare gravel. Inside, the marble floors were the same, but the silence wasn't. Theo's laughter carried through the halls most afternoons, chasing after a dog Diego had sworn he'd never allow and now couldn't imagine the house without. Diego had spent the year dismantling, piece by piece, the empire that once ran through these walls. Warehouses became legitimate shipping routes. Contacts became clients. It hadn't been easy, and it hadn't been quick, but he'd wanted it gone before Theo was old enough to ask questions Diego didn't want to answer. What remained was clean, boring in the ways that mattered, and entirely his own. Joyce's shop had grown too, into something twice its old size, shelves of flowers now standing beside cases of fresh bread, a name painted across the window in gold letters she'd chosen herself. Diego had backed every dollar of the expansion without asking for anything in return, watching with quiet pride as the shop filled with customers who came back not out of fear, but because the bell above the door had started to mean something warm. On a clear evening in early spring, Diego found her there after closing, Theo asleep against her shoulder the way he'd been the very first day. He didn't kneel this time. He simply took her hand, steady where it had once shaken, and asked her plainly to build a life with him. Not out of desperation. Not out of danger. Just the two of them and their son, choosing each other freely for the first time. Joyce looked at him for a long moment, Flower still dusting her apron, the shop glowing warm behind her, and said yes before he finished the question. Outside, the city moved on around them, unaware that the dangerous man once feared across Orlando had finally found the only thing he'd ever really wanted: a quiet life and a family to fill it. Looking back, it was strange to think how it all began: a crying baby, a desperate man on his knees, and a woman who had nothing left to lose but said yes anyway. Joyce often thought that if she hadn't opened that formula canister, hadn't trusted the small doubt in her gut, none of this, the shop, the laughter down the hall, Theo's small hand wrapped around her finger, would exist at all. Diego, for his part, no longer measured his life in territory or fear, but in ordinary evenings that once felt impossible for a man like him. What started as an act of desperation became the foundation of everything good in both their lives. If this story moved you, don't scroll past without letting us know. Hit like, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe so you never miss what we tell next. There's always another story worth staying for.